So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be here, very happy for the Foundation to have invited me and for this opportunity to talk about my book here today. The Spanish translation has been wonderful. It's been the best-selling translation into non-English of any of the languages, so we've been really excited with the success of it, and so it's very nice to be here in Spain today to talk a little bit about the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a sort of overview, try to make it fun, overview of the arguments in the book and develop the theory a little bit, and then I'm going to do something sort of really outrageous, which is to make some speculative application of the theory to the Spanish crisis. Okay, so I'm not a scholar of Spain or of Spanish institutions or Spanish history, but it seems I'm obliged to sort of say, what does the theory say about all the economic problems that Spain has been going through in the last decade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so let me get on with it without further ado. Why Nations Fail, what is the book about? It's about what makes some countries economically successful and other countries not economically successful. Now, at some level, the answer to that is very well known since the work of Robert Solow, the work that Robert Solow, the famous MIT economist, for which he got the Nobel Prize, back in the 1950s, he did a very famous study of long-run economic development in the United States, and what he pointed out was long-run increases in living standard were driven by what he called total factor productivity, by which he really meant innovation, okay? New ideas, new goods, new ways of raising productivity, labor productivity, human productivity, okay? And so societies that are economically successful are very good at generating total factor productivity, and societies that are not prosperous are not very good at generating it. And if you look across countries in the world today, the biggest part of differences in living standards and income per capita is driven by differences in this total factor productivity that Professor Solow identified in the 1950s. So it's good to start with the image of innovation. And if you go back and you think about what was it that created all this prosperity in the modern world, you think about the Industrial Revolution, that was all about innovation. It was about mechanization of production, textile manufacturing, new sources of power, the steam engine, new methods of transportation, railways. It's about innovation. Okay? So the argument in the book is that why is it that some societies are much more innovative than others? It's to do with the way those societies are organized, with the rules that create very different patterns of incentives and opportunities in different societies. Okay? So economists and social scientists use the word institutions to describe these rules. So as Vicente said, this is a theory about institutions, about how some sorts of institutions generate innovation and total factor productivity change, and other sorts of institutions don't. Okay, so to give you a sense of what the theory is, I'd like to start with a very, very concrete comparison. And the comparison is between the two richest men in the world, Bill Gates and Carlos Slim. Okay, now these are both extremely rich, very talented, energetic, clever businessmen. But the way they made their money is incredibly telling about the sources of prosperity in the world. Okay? How did Bill Gates make his money? He was an innovator, okay? Back to Solow. When he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he started a business. He got into software. He started Microsoft. He created massive innovation in software, okay? This is one of the leading sectors in the US economy over the past decades, okay? Innovation. How did Carlos Slim make his money? Carlos Slim made his money by creating monopolies, okay? So according to the OECD's calculation, it's a very for the economists in the audience, it's a very conservative calculation of deadweight losses of monopoly. Between 2005 and 2009, his monopolies reduced Mexican GDP by $129 billion. Okay, that's much more than his personal fortune. So this is not just about taking money from the average Mexican and giving it to Carlos Slim. It's a process that involves reducing Mexican national income at the same time. That's very different from what Bill Gates did. Bill Gates actually did the opposite. He created enormous amounts of positive externalities in the economy. He actually created much more wealth than he himself could take advantage of. He got very rich, but the national consequences are very, very different. So two different ways of making money. with enormously different consequences for society. In Gates's case, innovation, creating wealth, not just for himself, but all sorts of other people, sucking talent and people into the software and computer industry. In Slim's case, the opposite. Barriers to entry, keeping people out of telecoms, people blocking opportunities and incentives for other people. Two very, very different scenarios with very different consequences. Now, you might think, okay, but what's a different hypothesis about this? You know, couldn't it be that Bill Gates was a good guy and Carlos Slim was a bad guy? No, 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 absolutely not. You know, when Bill Gates wanted to, he tried to create monopolies. Okay, everybody wants to be a monopolist. You know, academics want to be intellectual monopolists, and he wanted to be a monopolist too. And what am I doing? Here he is, okay? What's he doing? What's Bill Gates doing here? He's appearing in front of antitrust authorities in Washington, D.C., promising to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So this is not a story about different people or different cultures or different personalities. It's a story about talented, energetic, creative people responding to the context in which they're in, responding to the institutions that they're in. And the thing in the United States is that the institutions, for all their problems, we can talk about that too, tend to push people in the direction of socially desirable activities like innovation. That's what's rewarded. In Mexico, the opposite is true. The way to make a lot of money is by creating monopolies, barriers to entry, rents, not through innovation, okay? Now, this scene here of Bill Gates being sort of dragged in front of the antitrust authorities, this is an old story in the United States. You know, if I go back 100 years before that, here's a picture of an octopus, but it's a very special sort of octopus. It's the Standard Oil octopus, okay? So Standard Oil was Rockefeller's famous cartel, if you like, and you can see the octopus has its tentacles around the White House and around Capitol, and the octopus was not only creating massive economic concentration, it was trying to capture the political system. But what's interesting about this, and this is the origin of antitrust policy in the United States, the Standard Oil Company was broken up early in the last century by US antitrust authorities, okay? So that's to say, it's not that the impulse to create monopolies is not there in the US, it is. But there's something standing in your way, which in this case is antitrust law and the enforcement of antitrust law. This scene was sort of impossible to imagine in the Mexican case, and it's not because Mexico doesn't have nice antitrust laws. It does. It paid consultants lots of money to write them. It's just that the government doesn't enforce them, can't or won't or whatever. Okay? So here I'm sort of introducing two layers of the theory. On the one hand, there's a structure of what we call economic institutions that create different patterns of incentives and opportunities and channel people's energies in one direction or another, towards innovation, towards creating monopolies. That's consequential personally, but it's also very consequential for society, as I'm suggesting. But now I'm also hinting that there's a sort of layer behind this, okay? Because it's not that Bill Gates didn't want to create monopolies. He did. It's just more difficult to get away with it in the United States, and not to say it doesn't happen, and etc. Okay, so that brings in something else. Behind these economic institutions, there's something enforcing these rules, these economic institutions, and that's the state. Okay, and this is where politics comes in, because our theory is about how economic institutions are important for economic development. But we're interested in explaining the variation in economic institutions. Why is it that Mexico has different economic institutions than the United States? And the main theory we propose is a political one. The economic institutions that a society has are basically an outcome of a political process. So that depends on the political system that a country has, okay? And we emphasize two dimensions of that political system, and I'm going to introduce some kind of jargon and terminology in a second. One of them already came out in this discussion, which is the capacity of the state to enforce rules and laws, and that differs enormously between the United States and Mexico. The other aspect of the political system comes out, you know, if you think about how Carlos Slim ended up with this monopoly. Carlos Slim got the monopoly because the state, his friends in the state, privatized the state monopoly and made it a private monopoly. So there's two elements of this, and what state was that? It was the one-party state the PRI, which started in the late 1920s and recently crumbled in Mexico. So the issue of state capacity is very important, and also what's very important is something else about the political system, the distribution of power or the nature of accountability within society, okay? So we try to sum this up by saying, let's introduce some terminology here, and we'll say, what is it that differs between the United States and Mexico? Well, we're going to say these economic institutions do, and let me put labels on them. And we call, what is it about the economic institutions of the United States that have these desirable effects? It's because they're inclusive, okay? Whereas in Mexico, you have a different set of economic institutions that we're going to call extractive. So this dichotomy is very simplistic. You know, the world is full of gray areas and nuances and things like that. And, you know, and I'm happy to talk about that, and there's a lot of discussion of that in the book. But in 40 minutes, I have to keep it very simple. I just want to get the basic ideas across, and then I'm happy to, you know, academics love nuance and balancing angels on pinheads and things like that. So if you want nuance, I can provide nuance, but let's just stick with the simple dichotomy to start with. Okay, so inclusive economic institutions are associated with technical change, innovation, prosperity. Extractive economic institutions aren't. So why this word inclusive? So this word inclusive, I think, is very important to kind of understand where that comes from, okay? And, let me do it by talking about this. This is the patent, Thomas Edison's patent for the light bulb. So when Edison invented the light bulb, great example of innovation, he took out a patent. Okay? The patent system was designed to protect his intellectual property rights to stimulate innovation. The patent system is a very interesting thing. Okay? So, and particularly if you look at who was it that took out patents, let's say, in 19th century United States. So this was a study done by the great economic historian Ken Sokolov. What Ken showed was that people who took out patents, like Edison, came from all over the social spectrum. Elites, non-elites, poor people, farmers, artisans, professional people. About a third of them had no formal education whatsoever. You know, Edison was sort of homeschooled. His father, you know, made roofing and things like that. So he was not an elite guy. He was not very well educated, but he was immensely creative and energetic. So the message from thinking about the origins of patent and the social background of patentees is that if you're thinking about innovation, talent, creativity, ideas, entrepreneurship, that is very spread out in society. You don't know where that is. What you need is a system of institutions, of economic institutions, that can harness all of that latent talent in society. And, you know, to me, one of the biggest generalizations about poor countries is that that's exactly what does not happen in poor countries. There's just vast wasted talent, wasted creativity, wasted skills. And that's what the patent system did. The patent system was open to everybody. You all paid the same fee, and the state enforced your patents, okay? So it's like, remember the state enforcing antitrust. The state enforced people's patents too. I once spent a week in the archive of James Watt and Matthew Boulton, who are two of the great innovators of the British Industrial Revolution. It's all in Birmingham, in the library in Birmingham in England. And the one thing I was struck with reading all their letters and documents for a week was they were obsessed with their patents. They loved their patents. They were obsessed with their patents. Patents played a big role in the way they thought. So it's an interesting example of an inclusive economic institution. Okay, so that's where this word inclusive comes from. So this is the economic layer: inclusive economic institutions, extractive economic institutions. You know, think of monopolies and barriers to entry and okay. But lying behind that is politics. Okay, it's not a coincidence that Mexico has more extractive economic institutions than the United States. Of course, there's countries in the world with much, much more extractive economic institutions than Mexico, but this just flows from my example, my motivating example. So we say lying behind the economics is the politics, and what really drives the creation of extractive economic institutions, for example, are extractive political institutions. Economic institutions are politically created. And there's two dimensions to political institutions. One is this element of state capacity. We call that political centralization in the book. It's not the terminology, it's hard to get that kind of terminology right. But think about it as having an effective state. Think about the idea of enforcing antitrust or enforcing patent, protecting people's patents. Okay? So that's what distinguishes societies with inclusive or extractive political institutions, but that's not enough. What you also care about is the distribution of power in society. So think about my example of, why was it that Carlos Slim ended up with this monopoly? That had a lot to do with the completely uncompetitive nature of Mexican politics. There was no political competition. It was not a situation where political power was broadly distributed in society, or there was very much accountability. That's also critical. So these two dimensions of political, what we call inclusive political institutions, are political power has to be broadly distributed in society, and you want to have a state which has capacity, or we call it centralized in that context. Okay? So this is the crux of the theory. Economics, inclusive and extractive institutions, lying behind that, politics, extractive political institutions creating extractive economic institutions, and extractive inclusive political institutions creating inclusive economic institutions. So, I don't need to talk about President Mugabe, and I could talk about lots of examples. I usually like talking about South Africa under apartheid is a great example of extractive economics and extractive politics, but, let me just kind of conclude this part of the talk by showing you this slide, which we have in the book, which kind of gets across a lot of the arguments, okay? What's the difference between, this is the Korean peninsula at night. You can see the south is very bright, and the north is very dark. There's a little spot of light here, which I guess is the presidential compound in Pyongyang. But other than that, it's very dark. Now, simple-minded economists nowadays use this evidence to tell you, this says something about economic prosperity and living standards, okay? The light bulb, I showed you the light bulb keeps coming back in this talk, you'll notice. So the light bulb's not a very old technology, but they don't use it in North Korea, or they don't have it, or maybe they have it, but they don't have any electricity. Probably they have light bulbs, but they just can't use them because there's no power. And in South Korea, they have all of that. Now, there's different ways of interpreting this. My wife said, no, you're jumping to, she's not an economist, so she said, you're jumping to conclusions. It could be that the North Koreans just think candlelight is more romantic. Or it could be that the North Koreans are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. I know Spain is very into that nowadays. So they have a very small carbon footprint. Perhaps North Korea should be getting prizes or awards for doing so much for climate change. But I think we know the real reason for this. The real reason for this is that North Korean society has enormously extractive economic institutions. Okay, this is a place where nobody has the freedom or incentive to do anything unless the ruling party allows them to, okay? And it's also very clear in this case that this is kept in place by politics. The reason that North Korean economic institutions create mass poverty and starvation for the citizens of North Korea is because that's the way the Korean Communist Party wants it, okay? I think this case is so clear-cut, there's just no debate, right? The harder thing to see is, this is a very extreme example. How would I use this more generally to kind of explain other societies historically or today? Our argument is that, this case is extreme, but it illustrates basically what's going on in all poor countries. And what went on in South Korea, leaving aside the discussion of the role of the state or whatever, is that institutions were much more inclusive, and that was underpinned by much more inclusive political institutions, at least today, okay? But the South Korea case sort of raises a puzzle, right? Because I'm emphasizing to have an inclusive economy, you need to have these two things. You need to have an effective state. Okay, they had that in South Korea. Most of the academic literature on South Korea says, there's a long history of bureaucratized central authority in South Korea. Okay, fine. But what about this other dimension I talked about? What about the distribution of power in society? I said the problem in Mexico was that there was no accountability, and there was a one-party state and no political competition, and that's how these monopolies got set up. But, a lot of Korean economic development took place in the 1970s, at least, under the stewardship of General Park. So I don't know if you know anything about General Park, but General Park, let's suffice it to say, General Park was not a Democrat, okay? But he nevertheless oversaw a lot of economic growth. So what do we say about things like General Park, and how does that fit into our theory? Well, I talked about that. We call that growth under extractive institutions. So it is possible, in certain circumstances, to have economic growth, to have periods of economic growth without this combination of inclusive politics and inclusive economics. At least if you have part of inclusive political institutions in place, if you have a state with capacity, then if the conditions are right, you can push economic development. So General Park decided, for whatever reason, that he wanted to throw the weight of the state behind promoting economic development, and he managed to do it. Our argument is very simple. It's just that can happen, but that type of economic growth, which we call extractive growth, is not sustainable economic growth. Okay? That the only reason that ended up being sustained in South Korea was because after General Park was assassinated, and the military gave up power, and a much more inclusive political system emerged in South Korea. So we illustrate, I won't talk about the other examples, but we illustrate this from history. There's many examples of extractive economic growth that looked very impressive at the time, but turned out to be transitory. The Soviet Union being the most wonderful example of that. Okay, China fits into this example of extractive growth. Okay, how did China do so well in the last 30, 40 years? Okay, well, in the 1970s, China was a very poor, technologically backward country. Starting in the late 1970s, 78, they started moving economic institutions in a much more inclusive direction. In the agricultural sector, the household responsibility system, that was all about introducing incentives and opportunities. It led to a massive increase in productivity, okay? Just like we would say. That moved into the manufacturing sector in the 1980s. So all we say on the Chinese case is that the economic institutions moved in a much more inclusive direction. That's generated economic growth, but that's never going to be sustained without an underlying inclusive political system. You can't create a prosperous society just on the whim of the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so in our sort of take on economic history is that concentrated political power always ends up getting abused at the expense of the economy. Okay, so if I could sum the diagram up I could sum the whole book up in a matrix. How am I doing? I have to shut up soon, don't I? If I could summarize the whole book in a matrix, this is what it would look like. Okay, in some sense, we're emphasizing prosperous countries are in this cell of the matrix with inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. Poor countries are in this cell of the matrix with extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. China is here. It's in the off-diagonal, you could say. It has much more inclusive economic institutions than it had, but it still has extractive political institutions. So what we emphasize in the book is these kind of off-diagonals are unstable. You can stay here, and there's a lot of stability in this system, as the citizens of North Korea have discovered. And you can stay here also. There's a lot of stability in this cell of the matrix as well. But in the off-diagonals, you have these fundamental incompatibilities. Okay, so let me jump a bunch of stuff, and let me talk about, before I run out of time, and let me talk a little bit about Spain, okay? So how would you apply this theory to thinking about Spain? Okay, so I thought I'd sum up the Spanish dilemma with a couple of pictures. It's always, my thesis advisor always used to say, picture is always better than thousands of regressions. So here's the other thing which I found on the internet, which is rather funny, from the banking crisis. You can see the capitalismo asesino, by someone taking some money out, or maybe not taking some money out, maybe trying to take some money out, but failing to take some money out. So how would you sort of understand these problems in Spain from our perspective? Well, first of all, it's sort of clear that our theory, think of this sort of dichotomy. Our theory is really not trying to explain, why GDP per capita in Spain is lower than France or higher than Portugal or whatever. From our perspective, Spain is a very successful society economically and politically. It has relatively inclusive economic institutions, relatively inclusive political institutions. We're really about trying to understand the difference between North Korea and South Korea, about difference between African countries or countries in South Asia, or the difference between Latin America and North America. Of course, there's a lot of variation within economically successful places, like Spain, like France, etc. Okay, so I would say the first thing to say is our theory is not really about, it's not really calibrated to explaining what's gone on in Spain. Okay, but nevertheless, let me say it's also clear, without, and we could talk about the history of Spain and whatever. Despite the checkered history of Spain from an economic point of view, as Professor Prados has sort of documented in many studies. Nevertheless, Spain was able to take advantage of many of these kind of institutional dynamics, I think, which created all this prosperity in Western Europe, over the last 100, 200 years. But nevertheless, it's also clear that there's been a lot of economic problems in this country in the last 7 or 8 years. There have been enormous increases in unemployment, falling living standards, people getting kicked out of their houses, unemployment. What's going on, and could we think about that from the context of our theory? Okay, what would you do if you were going to apply our theory to explain that? Okay, and I think the way to think about it is, even within any country which is basically successful, there's still elements of extractive institutions. There's lots of elements of extractive institutions in the United States. If I go out of my office, in Chicago and I turn the wrong way, in 3 blocks I'm in the ghetto. So there's lots of extractive institutions still lingering in the United States, and of course that's true in any country, and it's going to be true in Spain as well. Okay, so my reading of the evidence is that there's a lot of consensus about what caused the economic crisis in Spain. There's the proximate explanation is this boom, the boom in the financial sector, the boom in real estate, construction, housing. The boom collapsed. The collapsing boom created, crises. It created lots of unemployment. People and resources got sucked into the construction industry, for example, and they're not going to be seamlessly and frictionless, re-employed somewhere else in the economy. There's just enormous transitional problems in moving people to a different sector and things like that. Okay, so I think that aspect of it is well known. So what is it that caused this unsustainable boom with this bad economic fallout and crisis? Well, some of that I think seems to be very similar in all parts of the world, like Ireland or the United States. Financial innovation, securitization of mortgages. The financial sector innovates. It's like Schumpeter's idea that capitalism is just unstable. Innovation goes with instability, and maybe that's part of the story, people creating financial instruments whose consequences they didn't really understand. And when that happens, you have a crisis, you have a recession, and if you look back over the last 200 years of any country, there'd be big crises, big recessions in the 1970s, in the 1930s, in the 1890s. So from that point of view, that a Schumpeterian type of story is also plausible here. But what also seems to be true in my reading of the literature on this is that all of this was fueled by something which seems much more related to extractive political institutions, which is a sort of crony capitalism type nexus between politics, construction companies, and financial institutions and saving bank. That there was a lot of political interference in terms of economic resource allocation, construction, financial institutions. Okay, that seems to be the thing that you could describe, not as full-blown extractive institutions like you have in Sierra Leone or Zimbabwe, but nevertheless a well-defined aspect of non-inclusion in the political sphere. Okay, so that ties in with our discussion in the book of democracy, because in the book we emphasize a lot that we don't use this word democracy too much, because we emphasize that just having electoral democracy is not sufficient to have inclusive political institutions. Democracy can be very dysfunctional, it can be clientelistic, it can not generate a lot of accountability in the system. And my sense is that, to think about what I was describing on the last slide as this kind of nexus between the politics and the construction companies and financial industry, that's a real failure of the sort of quality of democracy in Spain. It's a failure of accountability, that somehow voters weren't able to discipline this. They weren't able to stop it happening. Maybe there wasn't enough transparency, people didn't know what was going on. But it's interesting that all these corruption scandals, don't seem to have had the effect of really putting a dent in the political system. And here's something, going back to my discussion of Solow and innovation and Bill Gates and the light bulb and total factor productivity, which I find very disturbing, which Professor Prados pointed out to me. This is his calculations of total factor productivity increases in Spain going back over the past 25 years. It's total factor productivity decreases, not increases. So the yellow line is the rate of growth of total factor productivity. And what he actually calculated is that since the advent of democracy in Spain, there's basically been no change in total factor productivity. Okay? So why on earth would that be? Well, that seems to be because somehow this transition to democracy hasn't created enough accountability or hasn't created enough inclusion so that it's allowed many extractive aspects of the economy to persist. So I don't know if this is about opportunities or it's about, the interesting thing about the construction sector is somehow you have a lot of resources concentrated in a sector of the economy that doesn't generate a lot of innovation. So maybe it's to do with the composition of the economy and the way the political incentives have generated a particular set of entry barriers or opportunities or rents. But this seems to be very sort of concerning from my perspective, this long-run performance of total factor productivity. So I think, Spain is a great success, but I think if I was going to look at this crisis through the lens of our book, this is where I'd look, that there's some problem with the way political institutions have worked. And, in some sense, dealing with the problem, the policy recommendation for this is very similar to Dr. Molinas's, I don't know if he's here today, I met him at lunchtime, Dr. Molinas's analysis of what's wrong in Spain. And he says what the solution to this problem is reform of political institutions. And that's exactly what our book says. Our book says economic problems are political problems. What you need is reform of political institutions. He has a very specific idea about electoral institutions. I'm not sure I know enough about how things work in Spain to know if that's a good idea. It makes a lot of sense. But it seems like the thing to do is, there's a lot of focusing on what I would call the proximate problem. Stop allowing politicians to nominate freely, members of boards of banks and things like that. Okay, fine. But that fundamental problem is a political problem. Okay, so you have to address a political problem by trying to think about reforming political institutions, and I guess I just wonder if that's happening in Spain. I know there's a lot of new political forces at play, and that's exactly what I'd expect, and I think that's probably a very healthy thing. But I also notice from our perspective, from this perspective of why nations fail, a lot of the political debate is about the wrong thing. The political debate is about austerity, which of course is horrible, and blaming the Germans for enforcing austerity, which may be horrible too, but that's not where the problem is. The problem is here, it's in terms of political institutions, at least that's what we would say, and I guess something of what I've been reading suggests that that makes sense. Okay, so that's a very speculative, I say this all with a great deal of trepidation, but just to sort of play with how you would apply the theory in this context. So I think I should shut up now, and you get to ask questions. Thank you.